Hello, today I'm going to cover the very first part of period one for APUSH, and our dates are 1491 to 1607. And 1491 was chosen very specifically because it is the year before Columbus comes to America. And so it's designed for us to include all of the Native American tribes that existed on this continent prior to the arrival of Columbus. And 1607 corresponds to the founding of the first permanent colony in America at Jamestown. Here is our first key concept. There are two in this unit. So key concept 1.1, if you look at this, it says, as native populations migrated and settled across the vast expanse of North America over time, they developed distinct and increasingly complex societies by adapting to and transforming their diverse environments. So there's a lot of things that you need to know in here specifically, and that is the idea of the different tribes, the different regions that we're going to look at here, and really how did they transform their environment that they were given, but also how did they adapt to the environment in which they lived. And you'll notice differences between different regions of the country as to how these societies lived. And you'll notice also right above that of the idea of developing distinct and increasingly complex societies, that some places were far more complex than other places in the continent at the time. To give you a little bit of context, by 1491, there were 50 million plus people in the Americas, about 15 million of who lived in what today is considered the continental United States. There were 10 separate cultural areas with over 1,000 languages. The theory is that they came from Asia over a land bridge somewhere between 30,000 and 10,000 years ago. It was believed that they were coming by following large animals, herd animals across that bridge. The area of North America 15,000 years ago warmed, and it reshaped the ecology and created the regions that we're going to discuss today. Here is an example of the different regions that exist. And we're primarily going to be looking at the plains, the eastern woodlands, the southwest, and the Great Basin areas, as well as the northwest coast. One important thing to know about Native American tribes is that societies that had maize, and this is a form of corn, obviously, they were more sophisticated, and we see them less in the area of North America than we did in Meso and South America. So this is something that the Aztecs, for example, had. But there will be tribes that will be able to cultivate maize, and it's important to understand that they are more complex, more developed societies, those that are able to create the conditions to be able to grow and harvest maize. We're going to start with the southwestern tribes. And in each of these, I'm going to start with what the climate was like and what the land was like to help you understand the need for people to adapt to and to deal with their climate. So, for example, we live in the Southwest. If you've been to Arizona recently or New Mexico, you know that it's very arid and very dry. It does not rain a lot. It can get very hot in the summertime, especially, and it's prone to droughts. We've had them in California before. And so, what's remarkable about them is that they adapted to their environment by developing irrigation. And that allowed them to cultivate things like maize and to be able to grow things, which was essential to being able to survive in such a harsh climate, but it also allowed them to develop more complex societies, as I mentioned prior to it. So, where we see irrigation, we see complexity. They were able to develop economically. They had trade with other tribes and within each other. In order to protect themselves from the environment, though, they had to create specific types of housing. So on the left, you see in Pueblo, and this is a picture I took when I visited Taos, New Mexico, and this still stands all of these years later, all of these centuries later. And these are made out of adobe. They're terraced housing, multi-story, and they're designed to keep it cool inside because of the clay that it is made out of. That is a sign of higher sophistication, as mentioned previously. On the right-hand side, we have the Anasazi, who are also known as the cliff dwellers, and they lived in these terraced locations that protected them from the heat as well as from potential enemies because they lived in the cliffs, and the cliffs protected them a little bit. Additionally, because they were more sophisticated, they were what we call sedentary, meaning that they didn't move. They were permanent settlements. And as a result, they were able to create large towns, large, complex societies with religious centers, with leaders, and all of that. So, the key thing that you need to know if you are looking at the key concept and the subconcepts that go with it is that the spread of maize cultivation from present day Mexico northward into present day American Southwest and beyond supported economic development, settlement, advanced irrigation, and social diversification among societies. If you move down to part B on the key concepts, if you're following along on the notes pages, which I put in Canvas, these societies responded to the aridity of the Great Basin and grasslands of the Western Great Plains by developing largely mobile lifestyles. So, in the Great Basin, which you can see pictured here, which covers largely Nevada and about half of Utah, it's desert. It's a different kind of desert where it does snow in the wintertime. So, it's kind of more high desert, but it's not a lot of rain, as mentioned before. There are a lot of salt areas, which are not good for growing crops at all. And so there is the need to, instead of being able to farm, they create societies where they are foragers, meaning that they go after looking for berries and things like that, the grow on trees, as well as hunting small animals. As a result, they are not permanent settlements. They have to create some type of housing that is going to allow them to move quickly and be able to reset up. And so what you see on the left is a wiki up, and it's made from wood and from twigs and different things that are easy to gather. Because there is a lack of natural resources, as I mentioned here, they are largely nomadic and they're going to be moving a lot. There are a few examples that are not, don't fit this model, such as the Utes and the Shoshones, but for the large part, they are nomadic individuals. In the Great Plains is where we find the most nomadic of all because there are just not a natural resources available. You can see that there are a ton of different Native American tribes that live in here, though, and many of them that we perhaps have heard of before, particularly talking about the Sioux, the Lakota. In the Great Plains region, again, there's not natural resources, there's not a lot of rainfall or anything, and so they are nomadic, and they really base their society on wherever the bison are. And in America, we tend to sometimes call them buffalo, but that is actually a misnomer. A fun fact is that there are no buffalo on this continent. They actually live in Asia. But what we call the American buffalo is actually a bison. And the Native Americans would use them for food. They would use all parts of their bodies for different things. And they use the entire animal. But in order to follow the bison, they needed some type of housing that would be easy to transport as well as easy to tear down and set up. And that was the teepee, which you see pictured in this painting below. And that is the main thing to know about the Great Plains region. Moving on to the Mississippi River Valley, you can see down here the Mississippian cultures. This area can get very hot and humid. It is good for growing things. So they did have permanent structures. They're a very sophisticated government with leaders and different subjects and everything that go down the way. They are believed to have developed iron tools, woven fabrics. Many of the things that are more sophisticated actually come from areas of Mexico and South America. They do engage in trade with other groups. And what you see below and above are pictures of Cahokia. At the top is a drawing, a painting that was created. And when I look at it personally, I think of very similarities to some of the pyramids that I've seen in Mexico that were part of the Mayan culture. So there seems to be a big influence, perhaps, that was coming from the Mayans and maybe even the Aztecs that came here. On the bottom right is where you see a picture of today, what it looks like. And they were known as the mound builders, and you can see why, because there are still mounds that exist today. The next one is the Eastern Woodlands. And these individuals who live along the Atlantic seaboard developed kind of a mixed culture. They had agricultural, but also hunter gatherer economies that favored the development of permanent villages. So here we have diverse, complex societies because of the fact that they did have some planting. There's some examples here of one of the tribes, the Algonquin, who used waterways. The thing to know about this environment is there's a lot of natural resources. There are trees, there are waterways, there are even natural harbors in the ocean. In this, there is a division of labor where men are going to go out and hunt, women are going to gather and farm. And in the next lecture, we'll talk about how this actually is going to create a kind of a cultural rift between the European settlers who come who say, well, men hunt for sport, yes, but women shouldn't be the farmers. Women should be in the home. The interesting thing about many of these Native American tribes is that they are matrilineal, meaning that they trace their ancestry through the women instead of through the men's families and men's names, and matrilocal, which means that women are the leaders of the society. There are extensive trade networks throughout this area. One of the interesting things that they grow there are what's called Three Sisters farming. And that's where in one single plant, they grow corn, beans, and squash. And that's something you definitely need to know is the Three Sisters farming. They have a lot of abundant food resources. They are semi-sedentary, as mentioned before. Here is a picture of where they would live in the Longhouse, which is a larger settlement where multiple families could potentially live. There is some kind of a structure, and they do join together in what's called the Iroquois Confederacy, which is one of the only organizations of Native Americans that's able to organize fighting back against the Europeans as they come. And I already mentioned the mix of agriculture and hunting. Also in the eastern woodlands, we had the Algonquin, as I mentioned previously. Here is a wigwam. So it looks a little bit different than we had seen with the Wickiups, but it's still not quite as permanent. And on the left-hand side, you see a picture of where the Iroquois Confederacy is made up of these 5 different tribes. And that is the eastern woodlands. Finally, we looked to move to the Northwest and eventually to California. In the Northwest, there are tons of natural resources, including rivers where they can find lots of fish. There are trees for lumber. There are fish, elk, deer. There is the ocean where they can find lots of shellfish. So they are very sophisticated societies. They are permanent settlements. They have very defined social hierarchies with chieftains of the communities and at different levels of society below that. They are very skilled at trading among the different tribes, and you can see pictures here of what is present day Washington state of all of the different tribes that existed there. They make these much more developed longhouses than you see on the East Coast that are made out of cedar wood, and they develop these very complex totems that tell stories about the tribe and the history. They make their clothing from grass and fur, and they also use bows, arrows, clubs, and spears. So they're very sophisticated in what they have, and the environment allows themselves to that because they have the abundant resources. Next, we have Alaska, and I took these pictures when I visited, except for the bottom one with the 2 fishermen in the ice. I did not take that one, but I had the opportunity a couple of years ago to go to Alaska, and we visited a example of a village, and I learned that they're very dependent on animals such as caribou, fish, reindeer, and moose, and they are dependent on them for food as well as clothing. And if you think about the fact that it gets to up to 40 below in the wintertime and it's extremely harsh, they need the entire animal for that survival. They use their heavy fur coats to make coats. And on the left-hand top picture, you see a woman that was dressed in one of these coats that would keep her warm in that very, very harsh winter. They also build structures out of wood. They have their little for camping because they would go and they would move throughout the year. The Athabascans, because they were nomadic, they were following the animals and following the fish. They would develop these structures that were covered in animal furs. So that is Alaska. And finally, moving on to California, where we actually have 6 different regions, and they include little bits of all of these different things. And you can see here in the Colorado River area, they had some subsistence farming to be able to feed themselves. Along the Colorado River, they were able to do irrigation because of the resource there. In the southern area, they were complex. They had chiefdoms. In the Great Basin area, however, it's going to be much more nomadic because it's very similar to what I already talked about in Nevada. In the central area, they had hunting. In the Northwest, they were going to use woodworking because there was an abundance of trees and resources. There were 3 different environments, too, if you think of the fact that we live in the desert region of California, but there's also the mountain region as well as the coastal region. So here is one brief review of kind of all of the different things that I discussed. You do need to be familiar with what the type of environment was, as well as how they adapted to the environment, both through food as well as settlements, what kind of societies they had, and also how they use their environment with that. So the economy is important as well as society. You would not necessarily be required to give a specific named example as long as you can describe that example. But I did give you all except for in California because there were so many tribes in California, I didn't have a specific one. And one thing then I want you to think about here, kind of a review question, is if you can name this, then you have understood my lesson. So you could go back and look at it again if you need to and read it again. But I want you to briefly explain the role that geography played in shaping three specific regions. So just to review, I gave you the Southwest region. I talked about the Great Basin, the Great Plains, the Mississippi River Valley, the Atlantic Seaboard, which is also the Eastern Woodlands, the Northwest region, the California region, and then there's also Alaska as well. So we've talked about many, many different regions within this. And I also want you to remember specifically that the more permanent the settlement, the more sophisticated the society would be. And a lot of this had to do with whether or not there were an abundance of natural resources or not for them to use. And that is all. If you have any questions, please let me know during our regular scheduled class meetings. Thank you.